Hey, MCARBO brother, I'm Chris Nelson, president of MCARBO. Really excited to introduce new SCCY CPX-2 trigger spring kit for your SCCY pistol. Love what we were able to accomplish with this pistol. Took it from an 8-pound trigger pull down to a 4-pound trigger pull, 50% trigger pull reduction. This pistol feels so much better now. When you're reeling out, man, into that break, just smooth, clean, light trigger pull. Love that. Great reset as well. We even tested with some of the hardest commercial primers, the S&B ammo, performed flawlessly. Really love what we were able to do with this pistol. This is an all-time running double action pistol, so it can be a little exhausting to try to shoot this with that 8-pound trigger. Not to mention just to maintain that reliable, consistent trigger pull is tough on an 8-pound trigger. Something smooth, clean like this 4-pound, night and day difference. Really love how much more performance and accuracy you get with this great little shooter right here. So it makes the SCCY a much more desirable pistol. Really love this. Let's get on our tabletop, show you what we did to it. Parts and tools needed for this build: the SCCY CPX-2 trigger spring kit by MCARBO includes a lighter hammer spring, a lighter firing pin spring, and a lighter trigger return spring. Going to give you a nice combined trigger pull reduction, a lighter, smoother, cleaner feeling trigger pull without compromising any sort of the reliability, the function of the CPX-2. Tools needed: 1/16 inch punch, 3/32 inch punch, 1/8 inch punch, hammer, bench block, micro tip, flathead screwdriver, and as always, guys, make sure we're an eye pro. As always, let's take this opportunity together to make sure our firearm's clear. Check the chamber, check the bolt face, check the magazine well. This firearm's clear. Let's see what kind of factory trigger pull we're starting with. 8 pounds, 1.3 ounces. Let's take one more to confirm. 8 pounds, 3.2 ounces. All right, so we're gonna get started with a real quick field strip. Go ahead and lock the slide back. Take your little micro tip. We're gonna pull out the takedown pin right here. Looks just like that. Set it aside. Go ahead and release the slide lock, separate the two. Go ahead and put the frame aside for now. We're gonna work on the slide disassembly first. So all we'll do is we'll remove the recoil spring and guide rod. Just push it in and it pulls right out like that. Then push up on the barrel, pull the barrel out, set the barrel aside. All right, so now what we wanna do is get access to this firing pin spring. So we have to remove this firing pin, but before we can do that, we have to tap out this little roll pin here that holds the extractor in place. So what we'll do is take our 3/32 inch punch, and we're just going to tap from the inside of the slide, get that roll pin halfway out, and it's going to allow that extractor and spring to come out, and there's a little pin in there that holds the firing pin in place. So what we'll do, bench block, 3/32 inch punch, go ahead and just give it a few taps, and we'll check our progress to see if it's released yet. All right, so about halfway, just like that. That's all we should need. You can remove your punch. All right, so if it springs out like that, you know you've got it released. So we can pry out the extractor. You can see this is the orientation right here. All right, very simple. So we'll put it back just like that. Set the extractor aside. Here's the extractor spring in there, so we'll remove that. Set the spring aside with the extractor. Then if you look inside, you can see that little pin that holds the firing pin in place. So what we'll do is we'll just press on the firing pin and it'll release into our hand. So we'll press on the firing pin back here. Just give it a little shake. There it is. So you can see the pin, what that looks like. Very simple. That large end is what goes into that pocket there. It'll go in like that. We'll do that here in just a second. All right, so now we can remove our firing pin and firing pin spring. So let's let it slide right out. There's the firing pin. There's the firing pin spring that we're going to replace. All right, so let's go ahead and open up our kit. We'll get that replacement firing pin spring. SCCY CPX-2 trigger spring kit by MCARBO. I'm going to save this bag just so I can put the factory springs in it. All right, so in the kit you get your lighter hammer spring, lighter trigger return spring, and your lighter firing pin spring. That's the one we need right this second. Set the other kit springs aside for now. We'll go ahead and we'll swap these out. So here's the factory spring here in my right, and MCARBO spring here in my left. The difference there, the factory spring is definitely thicker. The MCARBO spring is definitely lighter, smaller wire diameter. So we're going to put the factory spring back in that bag. We're going to replace it with the MCARBO spring. So what we'll do is we'll take the firing pin, put the lighter firing pin spring on there. We'll go ahead and we'll slide them back into the slide. We want that little pocket facing that hole where the extractor is going. All right, so we got the firing pin and the spring in. Just want to make sure we get that notch, that cutout facing that hole right there where the extractor is. So we want to make sure we can drop the pin in right in that notch. So we'll compress it. And what we'll do, because this can be a little challenging, holding it in place, we'll just drop in our other punch, just like that. I'm just using the 1/16 because we won't need it. And that's going to hold it perfectly in place. I'm just going to check with the flashlight, make sure I can see it. I'll take my 1/8 inch punch and just make sure it's perfectly lined up. I'm just pressing against it in there. All right, so the firing pin's in there. We've got it all lined up. We're gonna take our little pin. This larger end is gonna drop right in to that pocket. Take your little punch to get it to seat all the way in there. All right, so it's in there. We'll take our extractor spring and we're gonna drop it right over that little narrow portion of the pin. So it's located. So then we're gonna take our extractor and drop it right in over top of that spring. All right, at this point, we don't need this punch back here. We've already got that firing pin located with the pin. It's holding it in place, which is awesome. Now we just need to set it on the table, compress this extractor and spring so that we can drive that little roll pin through. Now, one little trick here is to take some masking tape, put it over top of that pin, just so you can protect it. Now, if you got a plastic tip hammer like this, you don't have to worry about it. So I'm not gonna use that masking tape, but that's an idea just in case you don't have a plastic tip hammer. I'm gonna take the 1/8 inch punch and just compress that extractor real good. Holding it down. And then I'm gonna take my plastic tip, a few good taps. All right, maybe a few extra there for good measure. I just wanna make sure it's held in place. Now we can finish it off just by tapping on the rest of that pin there on the top. So take your 1/8 inch punch, and you can leave that masking tape on there just to protect it. You know, if you slip with that punch, mark up that slide. It's definitely not worth doing. A few good taps. That was a 1/8 inch punch. Now I'm going to take my 3/32 and tap it the rest of the way. You just want to make sure you got a nice little even recess on both sides so that pin is completely recessed. So we're good there. Let's just check this firing pin operation. All right, firing pin's moving freely. Awesome. It's captured. We can go ahead and just press on that extractor a little bit. It's moving back and forth. Good. All right, so we're all set. So this slide is done. Just put the rest of the pieces back in the slide. Put the barrel back in. We'll go ahead and put the recoil spring and guide rod back in. This little end is going to go forward, flat, smooth surface. And locate on the back of the barrel, just like that. All right, so our slide is completed. We can set it aside and focus on the frame now. All right, first part of the frame disassembly, what we want to do is tap out these two pins right here. All right, we'll use our 3/32 inch punch. That's going to remove this aluminum frame here from the plastic frame. All right, it's going to allow us access to everything we need to replace inside there. So you can see your hammer right here, your ejector right here, and basically the rest of the frame. Real simple and straightforward. See the hammer spring down in there. All right, so those are the things we want access to. So we'll take our 3/32 inch punch, start in the back one here, tap it right out. All right, got the first frame pin out. Go ahead and set it aside. Get the second frame pin out, the forward one. And there's a second frame pin right there. We'll keep them separated, but you can see these pins are identical. So no big deal if you get them mixed up, but we'll just keep them separated for the sake of good measure here. So now what we want to do is remove the hammer seat here. That's what the hammer spring is actually engaging with to give it tension. So take a larger flathead and just pry up on it and pull it forward. So you just pry straight up, and you're going to pull it forward to get it over that channel right there. And it'll just kind of pop into place just like that. So these little notches right here is what keeps the hammer seat located in place. So we'll remember that going forward. That's going to be key. Now you can just take that flathead and just pry up back here on the aluminum frame. Just comes right out. And we'll do this slowly, trying to take a look at everything so we don't miss any little detail. You can see how this spring goes in place for your slide lock. All right. Flip it over here. Now you can see your trigger bar here, your trigger return spring here. And this is important, the orientation of the trigger return spring. We'll go over that here in a second. So we'll keep pulling up on it. The whole thing slides right out. There's your plastic frame. Set that aside. Now we're going to focus on the aluminum frame here. So it's really important to pay attention to those loops in the hammer spring. You can see the loops are facing the back of the frame away from the strike face. You can barely see it in there. That loop is facing the back of the frame away from the strike face. The strike face is right here. You can see that. a little beat up naturally, hitting that firing pin. All right, so the loops are going to be facing to the back of the hammer away from the strike face, both loops. And you can see that other loop is captured in there on that hammer seat. All right, so that's very important on the hammer spring. Take notice of the loops on the hammer spring are going to be facing the back side of the hammer away from the strike face. There's a strike face right there. So they'll be facing the back. And we'll go over that in detail again in a second. What we want to do is focus on getting this trigger return spring out first so we can get access to the hammer. So what we'll do is remove that trigger return spring. You've got to get the trigger bar out first. So you just take your little micro tip, and you're going to pop it right out. It's going to slowly unwind it. See how it all goes together. And you'll notice here how that little leg is captured through that trigger bar. All right, so you can see that little leg on the trigger return spring, how it locates through the trigger bar like that. We'll just pull back on that little leg and get it to pop right out. Set the trigger bar aside. Let that trigger return spring go forward. All right, so this is an important detail here. We want to match this orientation of the trigger return spring. You can see how it's forward like that. The way it's captured, it's right there, just like that. So we're going to match that. This is the trigger pivot here. That little raised feature on the trigger pivot is what locates in the trigger bar. So we're going to make sure we have this exact orientation when we put it back together. All right, so now we need to flip it over. We're going to take the rest of this apart. So go ahead and remove the slide stop right here. So just pull up on the slide stop, wiggle it out. There's the orientation right there. We'll go to put it back in. Set that down. We can just leave the spring in there unless it pops out on you. It's just a nice way to keep it all in place and remember how it all goes together. You just want to make sure it's fully seated when we put it back in. All right, so now we can remove that trigger pivot. It is a little tight, so we'll have to take our punch, set it up on the bench block, and just give it a little tap real quick. You don't have to tap too hard. It's just kind of held in there real snug. All right, so there's the trigger pivot there with the trigger return spring. It's almost all the way out. Just kind of wiggle it the rest of the way out. You can see how it locates in there. Here's our trigger, and that's it. All right, so there's our trigger and our trigger pivot with the trigger return spring captured by that little tiny pin in there on the trigger pivot. All right, that's what's keeping it all located in place, correct orientation. So you can kind of feel it where it's set in there, where that pin is engaging on that trigger return spring. We're going to replicate that exactly. We're actually going to use that new spring to pop out that pin, real simple and easy. And you'll notice how there's some flats cut in on this trigger pivot here. That's how it all locates inside the trigger. So those flats will line up, and that's what makes it a little snug right there. But we'll get it in that orientation just like this. All right, that's how it's all going to be seated in there. So what we'll do is set the trigger down. Don't need to worry about that. It's a little snug. There it is. Now we're going to go ahead and get this trigger return spring out. So grab the last two springs remaining in the kit. Hammer spring, we'll need that here in a second. All right, so now we're going to replace the heavier trigger return spring with the lighter custom trigger return spring. All right, so what we'll do is we're just going to push out that little pin right there that holds it in place. I'm just going to use this leg of the lighter trigger return spring to push it out, and we want to replicate this orientation right here. All right, so we're just going to push out this pin. I like to push on this side here. Seems to be a little easier, but it just depends what you got. If there's a burr on there, you may not be able to get away with using this leg of the spring. You may have to actually find a pick or a punch or even a paper clip. You know, it shouldn't be hard to push it out. This one just kind of popped right out like that. All right, so we're going to replicate the orientation. If I can leave that pin in there, I'm going to. All right, so you should be able to pull up on that factory spring. Go ahead and drop it aside. Put the lighter spring in there. Hold it in place, same orientation, and just push that pin all the way through. You shouldn't be able to pull out on that spring. You want to make sure it's completely captured in there and you've got the same orientation. All right, so you should be able to get this orientation right here. It's exactly what you want. Make sure that pin is recessed on both sides, locked in place. You can take your little 1/16. Just make sure it's kind of fully captured in there. All right, good. So that trigger return spring is replaced. It's in the proper orientation. It's captured on that little tiny pin in there. So we can go ahead and set the trigger pivot and trigger return spring down for a second. All right, so go ahead and grab your aluminum frame with the hammer spring on there. We need to remove that hammer spring assembly. So we'll take our 3/32 inch punch, and we're just going to push out on that pin right there. So you'll notice there's a narrow end on this side where the trigger bar was, and there's a larger end over here. We're just going to push out on the trigger bar side, that narrow end, and get that pin all the way out. You see that pin there, how it's got a larger head on it on the end here. That's how it locates in place. Set that down aside in a different pile. All right, so now that we've got the hammer hinge pin out, we do need to get this little hammer seat block off of the bottom portion of the hammer spring. So what we'll do is we're going to tap out that pin that holds that spring in place, You can see it there inside. So we'll take our 3/32" punch, just tap it right out. This side's a little more narrow. This side's a little larger. You should be able to see that roll pin on this side. So we're just going to take our 3/32" punch and tap it out from this side where the trigger bar was. So I'm going to set it up on the bench block, even use part of my plastic frame there to hold the assembly in place and keep it all level. I use this little notch here on the bench block to hold it in place. Works kind of handy. 3/32" punch. Be a little snug fit, but it drops right in perfectly. It's what you want to use to get that pin out. All right, we're going to give a few good taps, drive it all the way out. All right, so there's our little roll pin right there. So we got that out. We can set that down. Now we can take a look at the spring and the orientation. So just backing out that 3/32" punch. All right, so we really want to pay attention to this orientation right here. So you'll see it right there. So the loop is facing the back side of that hammer seat. All right, very important. We're going to replicate that exactly. So we can set the hammer seat down. We can go ahead and pull out our hammer and spring. Set the aluminum frame down for a second. And we're going to focus on this hammer right here. So the next step is to go ahead and get out this little top loop here. Pay attention to how that loop looks. So this loop is facing the back side of the hammer. Strike face is right here. Loop is facing the back side of the hammer away from the strike face. Very important. We're going to replicate that exactly. Let's go ahead and do it now. So we'll take our lighter hammer spring. You can see the orientation there. We're going to replicate that exactly. All right, so we're going to remove the factory hammer spring. It should just pop up like that. Just give it a little push. All right, so set that down. Put our lighter MCARBO spring in place. Should be able to just push it right onto that pin, just like that. Real simple and easy. If it won't fit for you, you just tap out that little roll pin there. And this one's actually sticking out just a hair, so I'm going to make sure that's completely compressed. Just take notice of yours, make sure it is compressed. And that's the orientation right there. So you want that little loop on the hammer spring facing the back side of the hammer away from the strike face right here. All right, good. So we got our hammer spring in place on the hammer. Now let's go ahead and take our aluminum assembly and drop that hammer spring and hammer back in. So it just drops right through that hole there in the aluminum frame. We can grab our hammer hinge pin, get it to locate in place. Remember this wider end here. So we're going to flip it around so we can get that wider end in, which is on that slide stop side. Line up the holes. Make sure you got your strike face of your hammer facing forward, right, away from the serial number. Line up the holes and drop in that pin. Little narrow end is going in first. You can kind of get it started and wiggle it in there. All right, drops right in. Good. Located through on the other side. Awesome. We've got our strike face facing the appropriate direction to the front. There's a strike face. You can see it all banged up from hitting the firing pin. It's natural. All right, now we want to get that hammer seat in place. So we got this loop facing the rear. Perfect. Facing the serial number. Excellent. Now we'll take our hammer seat. Just like that. That's the orientation. This little flat face is facing forward right here. So we'll drop in that loop just like this, in that center pocket. We'll go ahead and we'll get our pin started. Now notice this side is wider, so we'll start on this side where the slide stop side is. All right, so this side is wider. The hole, you can see there's a little recess there. Take a roll pin, drop it right in. Get it started by hand, and we'll have to give it a few good taps. Now we're just going to look through and make sure everything's lining up. All right, so you just want to see if it's captured. It's not quite there yet, so we'll just make sure we hold it good in place. Give it a couple more taps. We'll check to make sure if it's captured or not. All right, so it's in there. Hopefully it's captured. All right, so we got it captured, which is excellent. If it's not, you just got to tap the pin back in. You can also put a little, toothpick or something in there to keep it all in place to help line up that spring with the opposite hole. Not really necessary. This one's pretty easy. Doesn't fight you too much, but if you are having trouble, that's a little idea. We'll make sure this pin is fully seated. You just want to make sure that it's all the way in there. So it's completely captured there. There's a little recess. It's not sticking out. Good. Hammer spring is captured in the right orientation. You see that loop's facing the back side here of the hammer seat, which is awesome. All right. So loops are facing the back towards the serial number. Strike face is in there, facing the front, which is good. So we're all set on the hammer side here. There's one more good look at it there. It's all ready to go. So now we can go ahead and get the rest of the components back in. So now we can go ahead and put our factory spring away. At this point, all the factory springs are gone, which is good. Now we can just put the rest of it back together. All right, this is all we have left for the aluminum frame. So trigger bar, trigger pivot with the lighter trigger return spring, and then the slide stop going on the opposite side. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll put in our trigger and just hold it in place. Then we're gonna drop in our trigger pivot. Just goes in just like that. You wanna make sure you get those little squared flats lined up for that trigger there. Press it right in. See the orientation there on the trigger return spring, facing forward just like that. Good. Now what we'll do is we'll get our trigger bar, we'll get it to locate on that little raised portion of the trigger pivot there. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and install our trigger bar. Wanna make sure we get that little leg there, of the trigger return spring to locate in the trigger bar. So we'll just wind it back and we'll get it to hook right in, just like that. So you just get the trigger bar positioned, trigger return spring in your finger like this, drop it right in, just like that. All right, you can see how it hooks on the back side there. All right, so we got our trigger return spring to locate in the trigger bar. You know, I'm just keeping my finger back here on that hammer hinge pin as well, just to keep it in place, don't let it fall out on you. All right, that little flat on the trigger bar needs to locate inside that notch where the hammer is back there. So all we have to do is just kind of push down on that trigger bar and get it to locate on that pin right there. Just push down, snaps right in place. All right, good. So we got our trigger bar in place. Everything's moving appropriately. Awesome. So not a whole lot more to do from here. We're just gonna flip it on over. Everything's kind of held in by tension at this point. So what we're gonna do now is take our slide stop. We'll go ahead and get it set up in place. Make sure everything on the back side here is nicely compressed. So you can go ahead and get it to locate. Take your little micro tip. Just gonna pry up on that little leg right there and get that slide stop to locate just like that. You can test it. All right, good. So now we want to get it back in that plastic frame as fast as possible because everything's just held in place by hand at this point. So we're going to drop in that hammer seat just like this and rotate it. Just push in on the trigger a little bit, get it to drop right in that pocket there. Kind of compress everything at once. Good. All right, so we're all set there. Now we just need to go ahead and tap in these two frame pins right here. All right, so now we just need to go ahead and tap in our two frame pins. If you kept them separated, good idea. If you didn't, it's not the end of the world. They are exactly the same. So we'll go ahead and tap them in. Start with the back one first. Helps if you got a heavier hammer. Just compress that aluminum frame into the plastic as you're doing it. Get one started and we'll get the other one started. Compressing that aluminum frame into the plastic. All right, we'll just check the opposite sides and make sure they're going through appropriately. Looking good. All right, now we can go ahead and drive it the rest of the way home. It is a bit of a snug fit, so you just want to ensure that you got it going in correctly because it might feel like it's not right. I'm just going to take the 1/8 inch punch and just tap them the rest of the way through. A couple clean taps. Just check your progress. All right, a little bit more. There we go. So it is polymer and it's easy to scratch up, so you got to be careful. A couple clean taps. You know, if you're worried about it, you can also put a little bit of masking tape there to protect that polymer. Just checking the progress. All right. There we go. So we're all good there. So we got our pins in place, appropriately recessed, good amount of spacing on both sides. All right, so we're covered there. So now we need to set the tension on the hammer spring. Let's take our larger flathead. We're just gonna pull up on it. Just try to center it up as you pull it up and get it out of that magazine well there. So you pull up, we're gonna pop it straight back into that channel right there. You could use pliers, but risk damaging that polymer if you do. But it's up to you entirely. So I'm just kind of prying it up on both sides just like that and get it in that channel. It'll snap right in place when you do, which is perfect sound. All right, so we're all good to go now. There's tension on that hammer, good. All right, we can slide the slide right on. One thing you gotta watch out for, you know, in these skies, if this barrel's off just a little bit, kind of can it out of the way, you'll try to slide it on, it's gonna hit. You kind of saw that, how it just kind of hit. So if it's not lined up appropriately, it'll just kind of hit. So just kind of massage this barrel and recoil spring alignment there if it's not going on easy for you. And then what you're going to do is just lock it right back, pull that little barrel forward, make sure those holes are lined up, drop in the takedown pin, snap it in place. Good. All right, so we're all back together now. Test that trigger pull. Whew, that feels good. It's all-time double action, so no single action to test. Man, that feels way better. That's exactly what you'd expect there. Especially all-time double action, man. That's just gonna be terrible to have to fight an 8-pound trigger pull the whole time. Let's go ahead and test this trigger pull reading. Now let's see what kind of modified trigger pull we got. 4 pounds, 2 ounces. Let's take one more to confirm. 4 pounds, 0.7 ounces. Well, there you have it, guys. Really fantastic little shooter now. I love how this pistol feels, man. This trigger pull is night and day, and it makes all the difference. This is a great, really inexpensive pistol. Double action all the time. So you got to fight that stock 8-pound trigger. Not really desirable, not really conducive to good performance or accuracy. But with this 4-pound trigger, man, this makes a world of difference. This is really exactly what you'd expect. Not to mention all the reliability and everything else that we're able to maintain with it. You know, shooting those S&B hard primers, really love how the performance and accuracy and reliability all match and line up. I think it's a fantastic solution for some of the major problems with this pistol, being that the trigger pull is just way over the top. 8 pounds plus, some people getting. Really excited about this. Can't wait to see what kind of results you guys get. Post them in the comments below. Looking forward to it. Thank you, MCARBO Brother, for your ideas and your support. As always, happy shooting.